All right, folks, thanks. Picking up, thank you for being back. I let you out late, forgive me. But so Monday and Tuesday, and as I say, they're exciting days. I'm going to walk you very quickly without much comment, and I'm going to go back and unfold it. But I want you to see these 2 days as to what happens on these 2 days. You know what? My observation is that in many cases, people know the various events. They know about the Triumphal, they know about Gethsemane, but they don't conceive of it as an actual drama. And that's what I'm after, to understand that this is an unfolding real story. And Monday and Tuesday are very important. But let me tell you what happens on these 2 days. And so, first of all, Monday. So on Monday, and I take the 2 days together because I think they really are a piece. But on the way into Jerusalem, Jesus encounters a fig tree that has leaves. And because of the horticulture that day, like I said before, he anticipates that it will have figs, winter figs, which are available. This is a cash tree, but somebody planted that tree to make money, but the harvest is in the summer. This is the spring. That is, I said that wrong. The harvest is in the fall, and the summer figs grow during the summer. But at any rate, he encounters the fig tree and curses the fig tree on Monday morning. And then he goes and cleanses the temple a second time. I'm going to spend a good deal of time with this in just a moment. But then after he cleanses and controls the temple, basically he goes back to Bethany for the night. Now let me just say this about that, about Bethany, where he finds safety. Folks, let me tell you real quickly, in this culture, understand this drama in terms of its own culture. In an Eastern culture, if I accept you into my home as a guest, I am absolutely responsible for your safety. I will do anything. I will surrender my life. I will surrender the life of my family in order to protect you. It goes with the territory. If I accept you into my house, now, I have a friend in Israel. His name is Nael. He's a Bedouin Arab. He was my bus driver for a lot of years, and I would get him talking to the people on the bus, the people on the trip, about this dynamic, and he said exactly true. He said, if you come into my house, they actually, by the way, have a system where if you come to his house and he says, okay, you can, it's nice to visit, but you're not going to stay here, then when he pours your coffee, he just pours your coffee. And you imagine this, by the way, at a tent on the sands, okay? But if, on the other hand, you come to his house and you're welcome to stay as long as you wish, you want you to be your guest, and he will provide you with all that you need, including your security. Then when he pours your coffee, he lets it run over. My cup runneth over. I think that's the signal. And on the other hand, though, in the Bible, you think about it, Lot offers his daughters. Remember that when the wicked men were banging on the door and so on? In Judges 19, in this horrible story of the Levite and his concubine, the host offers his daughter. You think, what in the world? This is the culture. This is what is behind the 23rd Psalm when it says, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The point is, you've accepted me in. I don't care the enemies. You're going to protect me. That's the bargain. So the point is that here you have this little village of Bethany. Jesus was wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. Jesus was a fugitive. So it's all, you got to understand it. Where is Jesus going to find security? Bethany is right off the main road. That main road is going to be busy all the time. And so you can simply, he follows the crowds, goes into Bethany. Once he's into Bethany, both the Roman and Jewish authorities. Remember, by the way, here we are, Pilate. He's a prefect. He's a Roman officer. He's given charge of this particular area, Judea, Samaria. What are his two responsibilities? Collect the taxes, keep the peace. He can't handle a riot. And if he knows that if he or the Roman soldiers or the Jewish leaders go down to Bethany and try and grab Jesus and haul him off, there's going to be a riot. And so Jesus is, every night during this week, he goes back to Bethany where he is going to have a remarkable measure of safety. So that's Monday. Monday is the cleansing of the temple. I'm going to come back to it. Now on Tuesday, Jesus returns to the city, and along the way, he encounters that same fig tree, and it is withered up from the roots, and his disciples are amazed. And then Jesus goes and the Bible says that he controlled the temple. Now, the temple is 35 acres. It's huge. You can get 250,000 people inside the Temple Mount. It's there today, and they do that every year at Ramadan. So the point is that they have this large area, these courts, and of course in the middle is the temple itself. And Jesus takes control, and he's teaching. And his enemies line up to try and catch him in his words, and he puts them to silence. He puts them in open debate. And he argues from the 110th Psalm that he is the Messiah, and he answers the question of the rich, how does he call it? The young law student, the student of the Mosaic laws, the point is, who asked, which is the greatest commandment, you remember? So you have this marvelous teaching, but then, and this is where I'm taking you, at the end of the day, Jesus pronounces a series of excoriating woes on the scribes and Pharisees. And it's so doing that he drives the city to a decision. And then he returns to Bethany for the night once again and speaks the Olivet Discourse. Now, I'm not going to spend any time with that, but it's on Tuesday night as he goes back to Bethany that he stops on the top of the Mount of Olives. His disciples look down on this beautiful, vast, stunning Herodian second temple, and they say, it's a marvelous temple. And Jesus says, not one stone is going to stand upon another. And they say, what's the signs of your coming? And he preaches this discourse that we call the Olivet Discourse, Luke 21, Matthew 24 and 25. And we call it the Olivet Discourse because it was preached on the top of the Mount of Olives. All right, so that's a survey. Monday is the cleansing of the temple. Tuesday, he controls the temple, teaches, answers his enemies, and then as he leaves, pronounces these woes. Listen, a woe, W-O-E, is a term that is used in the Old Testament by the prophets almost always in regard to some Gentile nation. It's a curse. Woe unto you, you wicked nation that has defied Israel and its God, and so on. He pronounces those woes, and I'll come back to them on the Pharisees and scribes. So let me pick it up. First of all, now that was just a survey. Now I'm going to go through it. On the way into Jerusalem, Jesus curses the fig tree. Now listen, 2 points to be made, and I've told myself, don't stop on this. I'd love to. It's a fascinating issue. But Matthew tells the story of the fig tree as happening. He collapses it all into one day. That's wrong. He tells it so that the reader could think it all happened at once. He doesn't say it all happened on the same day, but when you read it in Matthew, it seems to all happen at once, on Tuesday morning. Mark is explicit that it was on Monday that he cursed the tree, and on Tuesday it was discovered to be withered from the ground up. Now, I'm not going to take you to those passages. I get lost in it, but just spend some time with it. And honest to goodness, even in the evangelical world today, even in the world of Bible believers who claim to believe in inerrancy, they're willing to give away, okay, well, there's a little mistake here, but it's not a big deal. And by the way, the rationale is always this. Well, we can't impose our 21st century canons of historiography and factualness and so on the first century. They were more primitive, and they were just telling stories, and they were more theologians. They weren't really historians. So sure, there are some little mistakes in the way they tell the story that didn't actually happen that way, but that's okay because it's the big story that counts. No. You can't give away the first. I better not go there. But the point is, just take my word for it. No, don't take my word for it. Check it out. But I implore you, listen, I was just talking to Kathleen. I'm going to go to this just real quickly. There is this mood today that, okay, maybe in point of fact, the way the story is told is mistaken. Here, I'll give you an illustration very quickly. There are 3 times in Luke, between 9 and 17, when Jesus sets out to Jerusalem. Jesus went to Luke 9:51, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Luke 13:22, going through the cities and villages, he came to Jerusalem. Luke 17:11 is what we looked at, going through Samaria and Galilee, he came to Jerusalem. The issue is that in Luke, he never actually arrives in Jerusalem. And so what we're told today is, in many quarters, Well, you know what? Luke just wants to add some life and verisimilitude, some reality. And besides, Luke liked to travel. So when he would tell a story about Jesus, he would say he was on his way. It doesn't make any difference. He probably wasn't on his way to. So in Luke 17, after he sets out from Jerusalem, it says that he healed 10 lepers. So the real story is the 10 lepers. And who cares if he was really going to Jerusalem? He evidently wasn't going to Jerusalem, and that's a mistake, but big deal. The story is the lepers, and that's what well, the problem is, I like to do this thought exercise. Think with me for just a minute. Imagine that you were struggling a bit with the issue of inerrancy. And you're just wondering, can I believe the Bible in all its parts? Even history, even six-day creation, can I believe all of it? And God in heaven, I'm making this up, it's a thought exercise, decided to settle it for you. So he sent Gabriel. And here Gabriel shows up in your dorm room. And he sits you down and he says, now listen, I just left the corner office. I am straight from the throne. God sent me to settle your heart. And I'm telling you, the Bible is true in all of its parts. All of its parts. Everything you read, absolutely true. Science, history, no matter how detailed it is, it's absolutely true. You can rest in that. But there's one mistake. But it's not important. I'm not going to tell you what it is. But it's not important. I promise you. It's not important. It's no big deal. So, the whole Bible is true, except for just one mistake. Now, here's my question. How do you read the Bible the rest of your life? No matter where you're reading, you're going to say to yourself, well, maybe this is the one. And then you're going to decide, no, this isn't the one, and go on. Who is in charge? Folks, as soon as you allow that there could be at any point, in any way, an error in the Bible, and every Christian throughout human history has believed that the Bible is absolutely without error. We live in a day when that's much challenged in our post-Enlightenment day, and it seeps into the Christian world, and now we find ourselves in so many quarters, I decided that that's not an error, so I can trust it. Folks, you ought not to be in charge. When you read the Bible ought to be in charge. That make sense to you? So I'm just saying that one of the places where in the evangelical world, many have caved into this idea, well, there's some mistakes, and Matthew says it was on Tuesday and it happened once, and Mark says it was on Monday and Tuesday, and one of the two is mistaken. And then, by the way, a lot of commentaries, this is what they give themselves to, which one is really right, and why did the other one get it wrong, or why did he change it? And that's supposedly what it means to comment on the text. So I leave it alone. It was on Monday, and the Bible absolutely says this. It was on Monday that Jesus discovered the fig tree, that he went to fetch figs, and it was not. See, here's the thing, too. You need to know this in that text. The Jews, this will seem unrelated, but it's not. The Jews do not begin, today it's different, but in antiquity, when you lived with the sun, you didn't begin the day with a meal. So you get up, you'd be hard at work, and you would work until the sun got hot, then you would break, and you'd go in, and it would be time of the morning sacrifice, and you would have your first meal. This is mid-morning, 10:30. So they would snack in the morning. They might take some grain and just get the meat out of it. You remember that Jesus decided, and everybody did this, and the fact is that, as I said to you a moment ago, there was a winter fig that was gnarly and unharvestable and messy, to be honest with you, but you could get a little meat out of it. And so one of the ways in which you might snack in the morning is go to a fig tree that had the leaves, which indicates the fruit is there, take some of those winter, gnarly, worthless figs and get the meat off. It was perfectly legitimate. And that's why Jesus saw that fig tree, saw the leaves, and went to fetch the fruit. Does that make sense to you? I believe, by the way, that the reason Jesus cursed it was that he saw in it such a picture of that generation of Jewish people. Because what happened on Sunday, he rode into the city, and the whole city welcomed him as king. Those are the leaves. That's the leaves. See the point? But on Friday, they're going to be crying for his crucifixion. And that's the no fruit. And I think Jesus saw such a picture of it and the disciples as well, the gospelists, that they emphasize. All right, now, then he cleanses and controls the temple. Folks, this is huge. And I could talk about it the rest of the day, but I'm going to be as brief as I know how. Now, number one, here is a drawing of the temple This is the second temple. The Jews have had in their history 2 temples. The first one was built by Solomon in 966 and destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586. The second one was built by a man named, Zerubbabel, Ezra 1-6. And Zerubbabel, by the way, remember my Jewish pronunciation? The other hint is that the accent is always on the last syllable, virtually always. So they would say it Zerubbabel, Jerusalem, Israel, Yaakov. But at any rate, the man Zerubbabel, Cyrus had decreed the Jews could return from the Babylonian captivity after 70 years. Cyrus, of course, the Persian, they go back and they rebuild the temple. It's a horribly disappointing little tiny wooden structure sitting on an unguarded hill. That second temple built by Zerubbabel was hugely remodeled. I mean, it's unspeakable what Herod did. And he built this marvelous, marvelous temple. And in order to do it, he had to build this huge temple mount. Here is a model of the temple. And this is a model in Jerusalem at the, but this area right here, for instance, these are the courts of the Gentiles. Here you can see it here as well. Well, here's a better one. Looking now down from the west, we're on the western hill, but these areas out here, you can get, like I say, 250,000 people in there. It's huge, 35 acres. And what had happened, of course, is this, that at Passover is the only one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts. There were 3 times in the Old Testament where male adult Jews were to make their way to the central altar, be it the tabernacle or later the temple. And the only one that included an individual sacrifice was Passover. And every family had to bring a lamb. It had to have that lamb secured by the 10th of Nisan, and then on the 14th of Nisan, that lamb was slain at the temple. And then the meat was taken, and you'd go to your home and indoors, and you would have your Passover meal. Now, the point is that every family had to have a lamb, and you had most families, because it was a pilgrimage feast, didn't bring a lamb. They would buy a lamb, which is perfectly legitimate. But after you bought the lamb, the first thing after you bought your lamb, and you would inspect it to make sure it met all the Levitical qualifications, at least a year old, and didn't have any blemishes and so on. Then you took it to the priests, and the priests would inspect it and either accept it or reject it. Well, the priests at this time were unspeakably, there was a remnant. There was a Zacharias, remember the father of John the Baptist, but by and large, they were horribly corrupt and self-serving and merchandising of the people. And so the priests, and specifically the Sadducees are the chief priests. They run the temple. I'm going to come back to it. But they realized that we got a good thing going for us. Here these people are coming. They're buying a lamb from a shepherd, and then they're bringing it to us. And so they just made it clear that they wouldn't accept the lamb unless it was sold to them by a shepherd who was giving them a piece of the action. There's a huge kickback thing going on, and they were making themselves hideously wealthy, and the people were paying above market prices for the lamb because of the kickback to the priests, and they insisted, well, this is legitimate and so on, but the people despised it. Now, the other function is this, or the other factor, I should say, is that in order to build this marvelous temple, Herod the Great, now he's a dead guy. He died when Jesus was born, right? So, but he built this temple. He didn't, okay. In order to build it, to afford it, and by the way, it was a huge cash cow. Herod was a genius. And he had he built a harbor so that he could capture the spice trade coming up from the south and warehouse and so on. He was so wealthy that he couldn't, it's uncalculable. And the biggest cash cow was this temple, because he had gotten Rome to impose a 2-day tax, that is, whatever you make, 2 days of wages, on every Jew in the world. And you think, well, who's going to collect that? Big deal. Oh, no, he didn't have to collect it. The Jews all over the world would come together and bring their 2-day tax and put it in a coffer and have a small army that would take that off to Jerusalem. There'd be great pomp, and they'd come and pour that money into Herod's coffers and so on. So, but the point is that if your name was not on the list, if you hadn't paid, if you didn't have, because there were tokens they would give, if you didn't have a token to demonstrate you'd paid that 2-day tax, then you had to pay it in order to come to Passover. And the Sadducees, the chief priests, had volunteered, as it were, to collect that, but only on one condition, that it be paid in local currency. So now you got to change your money. And the Sadducees are changing the money and charging horribly usurious rates. So here's my point. Here you are, you're a godly Jew, you've come from a long way, it's Passover, and they didn't come all the time. I mean, in the Old Testament they did, and it was unusual if they did, but most people, maybe once or twice in their lives, they were able to get to Jerusalem for the Passover, especially if they lived out in the diaspora. You've come a long way, you did what was right, you bought a lamb, you bring it to the priest, you know the lamb is fine, and the priest says, no, it won't work. Now, I'll tell you this, I'll take that one in trade, and you can go over to that guy over there, he bears a certain family resemblance, and you can buy one from him. So now you got to go over, and I'm making part of this up, but you can imagine what's going on here. And you're paying high rates for the lamb, and the priests, of course, are living in luxury and plenty and so on. The people despised it. And so now, understand this. 2 times in Jesus' ministry, I said to you with regard to the length of Jesus' ministry that there are 4 Passovers in the life of Jesus, in the ministry of Jesus. The first one is John chapter 2. He cleanses the temple. Think about it, folks. Stay with me. Jesus was wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. And think about the dynamic here. Jesus, at the very beginning of his ministry, Jesus goes up and cleanses the temple. Folks, if you're alive in that day, this is the most exciting thing that ever happened to you. You're at Passover. You resent all of the shallowness and the wickedness and the merchandising of the people and the Sadducees, the chief priests strutting around like kings and so on. And all of a sudden, this crazed Nazarene, this stonemason worker from the north, takes a cord and he begins to drive the animals off the Temple Mount, and he's overthrowing them, and he says, "You'll not make my Father's house a den of thieves." And that quick, Jesus is the folk hero of the masses. This is Passover. Everybody's going to be going home. Everybody's going to be talking about this. You can't believe it was the most exciting thing I ever saw. Now, why? How did he get away with it? Well, as soon as he did it, the masses were on his side. And if the Sadducean leadership had tried to do something about it, they knew there'd be a riot. And if there was a riot, then the Romans would come and chase it down. And if we're the ones who caused that riot, our heads are going to roll. There is such wisdom. So when Jesus cleanses the temple at the first time, at his first Passover, number one, he catapults himself into notoriety. Nobody is talking about anything except for this excitement where the Nazarene, this guy, we never heard of him. But this is the only miracle he's done to this point is the water to wine. And it's as far as explicit in the record. And so he's still very unknown, but all of a sudden, everybody knows him. But he does something else. As a matter of fact, let me see if I can find it here. You need to understand, and I'm going to show you a slide here. So find a way to somehow record this. It's very simple. I'll go further. But know this. When you come to the New Testament, you encounter these 2 sects, these 2 groups, and they are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So much to know about them, so important, but know this. What I'm trying to communicate to you right now with regard to Monday and Tuesday, you're going to understand if you understand this chart. So on the one hand, the Pharisees, they controlled the synagogues. Now, to help you appreciate this, you have to know, stay with me as you write, you have to know that the synagogue was not a temple. You didn't do any sacrifice there. It was not a church. There weren't any churches yet, but it wasn't a church. It was the center of your life. Synagoge means coming together place. And it's just where you go. I go back to Fiddler on the Roof. Remember Tevye, if I were a rich man, all day long I would sit and I would talk with the doctors and so on. That's what you do at the synagogue. You sit around, you hear the news, you maybe look for jobs, you find a spouse for your children, for your child. I mean, it's just the center of your life. The synagogue is everything to your life. And the Pharisees controlled the synagogue. Now, I like to say that control of the synagogue was if you don't mind, de facto. You know what I mean by that? There was no, it wasn't written down anywhere that all the synagogues had to answer the Pharisees. The fact is that what made a synagogue was a copy of the Torah. And you couldn't have a copy. You couldn't go down, you know what the Torah is? The 5 books of Moses, right? Our Pentateuch. And you couldn't go down to Barnes & Noble and buy you a copy of the Torah. You had to hire somebody to copy it down. And that person would be a scribe. And the scribe gave his life to copying and teaching the law of Moses. And those scribes were almost all, there were a couple exceptions in the Bible, but they were basically of a Pharisaic variety. So the point is this, that the Pharisees controlled the synagogues because they were the absolute embodiment of law keeping. And the synagogues were built around reading and keeping the law. So the Pharisees had control over the synagogue. Secondly, I say there that they believed the entire law, including the oral law. Now, this is a plague even, that's a little overstated maybe, but I think that the Jewish people are frankly quite crippled because they pay so much attention to the oral law. Matter of fact, they don't really read the Scripture today. They think it would be almost an affront to read the Scripture. So you read what the rabbis have had to say about the Scripture, and that's recorded in the Talmud, the Jewish literature, the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Tosefta and so on. So you have these oral laws, these traditions. Remember, Jesus said, by your traditions you make void the law of God. Oh, I could spend time with that. But they believed it, and they studied it, and they were students of that is, they knew well primarily what the rabbis had said about the law, but even the law. But notice the bottom. This is huge. That they, with regard to the common man, they were respected and feared. As a matter of fact, I would say they were revered. See, here's the thing. Now watch this. Go ahead and write, but watch this. The Pharisees, as I say, they were full-time law keepers. That's what they did. Now you say, well, how did that work? Well, they would study the law. They didn't work. They lived on the alms of the people because they were studying the law to help them understand the law and to keep the law. And here's the thing. And remember, why is the law so important to the generation, the Pharisees of Jesus? Because this is the entrance to the kingdom. This is how you can assure yourself. Listen, there's been a debate over the last 20 years over how we understand the Pharisees. And there's been a lot of confusion for my money. And people will say, well, you read the Talmudic rabbinical writings, and they talk all the time about the grace of God. Oh, yes, they do. But this is what they mean. God is so gracious that he gave us the law. And all we have to do is keep the law, and he'll accept us into the kingdom. This was the Pharisaic gospel. And it was soul damning. And Jesus came to confront that. But the point is, this is what I want to take you back to. You read in the Bible about the Pharisee who comes and stands in the temple courts and they blow a trumpet and he puts his tithe and everybody hurrahs and so on. And then he brings his garden vegetables and counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and puts a little leaf in the treasury and so on. And everybody, oh, that's great. And you say to yourself, well, that's just that kind of ostentation, that kind of display, that's disgusting. Oh, no. This is what you got to understand, folks. This is so pivotal to what's going on here. To the common man, the Pharisee was not just keeping the law. He was, in some sense, keeping the law on my behalf. I don't have time to be that punctilious about keeping every little tiny tradition and so on, but he does. And he gives them. And I am advantaged in my quest for the kingdom to attach myself to this Pharisee who is giving himself to keeping the law. So the Pharisee was revered. On the other hand, I'll say it one more time, the Pharisee, if you made him mad, could toss you apo synagoge. He could toss you out of the synagogue. And that was a horrific prospect. And so the Pharisees very much controlled the common man. Now, you go to the Sadducee. The Sadducees controlled the temple. And let me say, that was a matter of de jure. You know what I mean? That was by law. They had bribed the Romans. They had been given control of the temple. They are called the Sadducees. In the Old Testament, I haven't got time to walk you through it, but there is a fascinating and important series of events by which the high priest becomes a man named Zadok, and he's called a faithful priest. And Zadok is the guy, this is 1 Kings chapter 2, Zadok is the guy who has a right to the temple. The word Sadducee is almost certainly just a corruption of the word Zadokite. So they were insisting, we're the ones who have, just like Zadok had control of the temple, we're the Zadokites, we're the Sadducees, we control the temple. Now, many of them weren't even priests. They were carpetbaggers. They had finagled themselves in and so on, but they had control. And by the way, in the Old Testament, when a man became the high priest, how long was he a high priest? Do you know? Till he died. It was a life office. In the New Testament, it was a year by year, because what had happened is the Romans had realized how strategic that office was and how you could control the people if you controlled the high priest. So they put it out for bid, and people would bid to be the high priest, and that means you had to pay X number of dollars, and everything you made off the temple structure, above that you got to keep, and you made yourself very, very wealthy. The Sadducees were entirely in league with the Roman officials. That makes sense to you? And I say they were functional unbelievers. They didn't believe anything. They had been totally given over to Greek thought and so on. But most importantly, they were despised and resented by the common man. All right, so here's the short story. Are you with me? This is important stuff. Pharisees controlled the common man, the synagogue, and they were hugely respected, revered, and actually feared. The Sadducees controlled the temple. They cared nothing for the common man. They had nothing but contempt for the common man, and the common man returned the favor, so they were despised by the common man. Furthermore, the Pharisees and Sadducees despised one another. But Jerusalem, and ultimately all things Jewish, was controlled by this body of men called the Sanhedrin. And in Jesus' day, there was 70 men ruled over by Caiaphas, the high priest. And in Jesus' day, it was almost evenly split between Pharisees and Sadducees. And they hated each other. Now, I believe, you got all that? I'm going back to the cleansing of the temple. John 2, first Passover of his ministry. Jesus cleanses the temple. Number one, he becomes instantly the greatest folk hero in Jewish history. Everybody is excited about him. Secondly, think about this. All right, let me just ask you, whose turf is he stomping on when he controls the temple? It's the Sadducees. They were mad beyond words. They couldn't believe. But how do you think the Pharisees felt about it? Oh, this is great. I'm sure Jesus was for a few little time. It was their great hero. So now you've got the Pharisees, and you've got the Sadducees angry at Jesus, the Pharisees supporting Jesus, and that's what, you see, once Jesus becomes a hero, the Jewish leadership cannot on their own be done with him, because there will be a riot and our heads will roll. So if we're going to be done with him, we have to get the Romans involved. But the only way to get the Romans involved is through the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is totally divided over Jesus. Now, watch this. Jesus was wise as a serpent. There are 4 Passovers in Jesus' ministry. He cleanses the temple the first Passover. The second, third, he leaves it alone. There's nothing in the record. So but where is he going through the next 2 years? Synagogue to synagogue. Now whose turf is he on? See the point? And the Pharisees, you can watch it happen in the scriptures, are getting more and more angry with Jesus. And I'm sure they were going back to the Sadducees and saying, you got to do something about this. And the Sadducees saying, hey, when it was our ox being gored, you were nowhere to be found. Now he's on your territory. We're enjoying this. But here I'm taking you. When Jesus, on Monday morning of the Passion Week, goes in and cleanses the temple a second time, now watch this, he galvanizes the hatred of the Sadducees with the hatred of the Pharisees. Now both Sadducees, think about it, on Monday, he rode into the city in defiance of in defiance of the fact that the Pharisees primarily had put a price on his head. So that's defying the Pharisees. On Monday, He cleanses the temple. And once again, look, folks, this is Fat City. This is, I always say, what would it be like if here in America, the government, for whatever, like it needs a reason, said that, you know what, this year, every retail establishment has to close down the day after Thanksgiving, can't open until January 10th or something. What do you think? It'd be a tough season, right? That's what's going on here. This is Passover. Thousands and thousands of people coming, paying their tithe. This is where the Sadducees make themselves rich for the rest of the year. And Jesus comes and throws over the tables and drives them off. And then for 2 days, he controls the temple. The Sadducees are purple, glow in the dark, angry with Jesus. And the Pharisees have been that for a long time. So I'm saying, he cleanses the temple at the beginning of his ministry, catapults himself into ministry, angers the Sadducees, delight the Pharisees, sets them against each other. But then he angers the Pharisees as he goes from synagogue to synagogue. Now on Monday of the Passion Week, he cleanses the temple a second time. Now the Sadducees are fully on board with the Pharisees. We got to be rid of this guy. And when Jesus cleansed the temple on Monday morning, he is signing his own death warrant. He knows what he's doing. He knows that it's time for him to give his life, and to that end, he galvanizes the hatred of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and it's going to take him 5 days to get him on a cross, all right? So, the cleansing of the temple, and it did happen twice. There's some debate, but it happened at the beginning and then at the end of Jesus' ministry. That is on the first Passover in John 2, and now the Synoptics tell us about the cleansing of the temple during the Passion Week. And then he returns to Bethany for the night. Now, I'm in trouble. Let's go quickly. So on the next morning, it's Tuesday morning, and he finds the tree withered. And I already talked about this. He takes control of the temple. And I would say, can you see that? I don't know if you can see that, but I would say that this is just a thought, that Jesus never behaved more messianically than these 2 days. Remember now, folks, I'm exploring the question, given Sunday, why Friday? And I'm saying it's Monday and Tuesday. And you have to understand the tactics and the Jewish setting of what Jesus is doing. So what he does is he cleanses the temple, takes possession. Look, every Jewish person knows that when Messiah comes, he's going to rule in the temple. The temple belongs to Messiah. And let me say that his enemies come and they try and catch him in his words. I'd love to go through that. It's in your notes, but I'm just going to say that, I always say that in our culture, guys, if you wanted to prove you were a man among men, what would you have to do? I don't know. Maybe sink the winning basketball, or free throw, or beat everybody in the room in arm wrestling. In this culture, you want to prove that you're a man among men. Jewish culture, you silence your enemy in open debate. And when Jesus takes on they come and they say, by what authority to do these things? And he says, I'll ask you a question. The baptism of John was of heaven or of men? And they knew if we say it was of heaven, that we've acknowledged that he is what he claims to be. If we say it was of men, these people will stone us. They love John. And they come back and they say, Master, we have no answer. Folks, the place would have exploded in huzzas and clapping. And in one Jesus had defeated his enemies with one argument. It's stunning what's going on there. I could spend a lot more time with it. He does that again and again, and he argues from the 110th Psalm that he is the Messiah and so on. Now, the point is this, that at the end of the day, Jesus pronounces these excoriating woes on the Pharisees. Now, I want to take you there. By the way, this is an oral culture. They know how to listen. They know how to actually take what was said and say it to the next group back. They were very good at that. They could memorize as they heard it and so on. Jesus is doubtless talking to thousands of people here in the Temple Mount. Second, there's nothing else going on. This is the most exciting thing. Yesterday, he cleansed the temple. It's amazing. Now, a second time. And so now we crowd to the temple. He's teaching. We listen as he defeats each of his enemies in open debate and so on. And now all of a sudden, Jesus stands and he begins to speak, and he says, Jesus spoke to the multitudes, and he said, the scribes and the Pharisees. He says they sit in Moses' seat, they teach, and he says, don't do according to their works. They say and do not do. But then it gets worse. Let me keep going. He says, there are going to be 8 woes. 8 times he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And here he says, you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. They claim to be the gatekeepers. They were the means of getting you into the kingdom. And the people have got to make a choice between Jesus, who is offering himself as the means of, and his death as the means of entering the kingdom, and the Pharisees. And Jesus says, you shut up the kingdom. You're not going in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You travel land and sea to win one proselyte. When he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. These are the disciples of the Pharisees who are gathered there. And Jesus says, you're a child of hell. You're blind guides. Woe to you, scribes. I love it where he says here in verse 24, blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. I'm going to tell you something, folks. That is hilarious. I mean, it is such a hilarious, dark humor picture of who the Pharisees. You can listen. The Pharisees, the law says that bugs are unclean. Shouldn't eat bugs. Well, the Pharisees had said, the Talmud, the rabbis, that, okay, some bugs are microscopic, but if they are visible to the human eye, you're going to violate the law if you eat it. So they would take every leaf of lettuce and they would hold it up to the light before they'd eat it. And they'd make this big deal about washing it off and squirting. Then they go to the next one. Take half a day to make a salad because they got to go through everything. And so they strain out a gnat, but they would swallow a camel. Camel is unclean. But everybody knew that this was the Pharisees. That with all of they had all these casuist arguments for doing the most awful things. They would divorce their wives and go off to another village supposedly to teach and marry a woman for a few days and then come back, divorce her and come back. This was well known. And yet these Pharisees, and again, I got to hurry. Again, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You're like whitewashed tombs. Look, if you got up against a human tomb, you were unclean. And the problem was that Jews didn't normally bury in cemeteries; they buried somewhere in their back 40, as it were. So here you are coming down to Passover coming down to Jerusalem for Passover, and you just decide I'm going to sit under that tree and rest a while. And somebody comes along and says, "I'm sorry, it's all covered up, but this is a tomb, and now you can't even go to Passover." So the rabbis had decreed that at Passover season, everybody had to go down and just slap a little lye on that little whitewash on their tomb so people would realize it's tomb, because if you rub up against it, and if you looked at it on the hillside, it was kind of nice, these whitewashed tombs, as spotting the. But if you just rub up against them, you become a stench in God's nostrils. For Jesus say, "Your whitewashed tombs, woe to you, scribes," and then he winds up by saying, "Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell?" All right, folks. Here's my point. Given Sunday, why Friday? The answer is Monday and Tuesday. To really understand this, you have to realize that Jesus, again and again, puts his finger on the most sensitive spiritual nerve, and when he's doing it with a crowd, the best way to do it is say, "It's me or the Pharisees. You choose." And that's what he's doing. Just as I said, you got to see him pointing in Matthew 5 and 6 on the Sermon on the Mount. They said, "Now you stand him saying that here are the Pharisees, madder than you can imagine." And by the way, do you notice that there is no reference to the Sadducees? He never calls down a curse on that because they didn't deserve it. No, it's because nobody was following the Sadducees. They hated them. But the issue is, these people had decided to side with the Pharisees and their gospel of works righteousness, keeping the law, and reject Jesus. And Jesus is saying, you make a choice. So I'm saying to you that on Sunday, as Jesus rode into the city, it was easy. There was no cost. Throw down your garments. We're sick of Rome. Maybe so. If he delivered us, that'd be great. He raised Lazarus, may be our king. Now Jesus, as he does again and again, thins the crowds. And he does it by saying, look, I like to say it this way, that on Sunday as he rode into the city, he made a legitimate offer, and he is qualified to make that offer. And that offer is, I will be the Savior that you have promised, beginning in Genesis 3:15. On Monday and Tuesday, he took control of the temple, and he made this point. Because on Sunday, it seemed like they were willing to accept him. And so the point of Monday and Tuesday is simply this, folks. You don't take Jesus on your terms. You take him on his terms. And his terms are, you surrender any hope of righteousness through keeping the law. You turn your back on the Pharisees who can make life so miserable for you. You follow the truth no matter what it costs you. That's what it means to give your allegiance to Jesus as Messiah. Not throwing on your garment as he walks into the city. It means obeying him, and what that means is turning your back on the Pharisees. And as I say, that challenge was made on Tuesday. On Friday morning, the city announced its verdict.